The Madman theory is a tactic employed as part of a wider strategy by a sane leader who feigns irrationality in an attempt to convince his opponents of an irrational, excessive response to a situation. I think that what you see is Richard Nixon acting as a fulcrum, if in many ways, between the past. If we look at what Donald Trump does, and he is certainly a polarizing figure, you can see that he has attempted through his first term and second term to utilize the Madman theory approach to international relations. Is Donald Trump a narcissist? I don't think you'd get too many people arguing with that. He uses public perception of him and his character to basically more easily implement the Madman theory, because people are very willing to believe that he is a madman and therefore are terrified that he might actually go through with some of these threats, whereas a perceived sane individual like Richard Nixon had difficulty convincing people of that.
So could the Madman theory be applied in business? James Boyes, welcome to Visionary.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again.
Now, to start with the basics, what is the Madman theory and where did it come from?
Okay, so there's two vital parts to your question. First of all, the Madman theory is a tactic employed as part of a wider strategy by a sane leader who feigns irrationality in an attempt to convince his opponents of an irrational, excessive response to a situation, in the hope that their opponent will acquiesce out of fear that there is a 1% chance of an extreme act being performed upon them. Where does it come from? It's two elements. There is a theoretical element and the political element. The theoretical element begins on the Harvard campus in Massachusetts and at the laboratories at the Rand Corporation in California. In the 1950s, a series of Cold War game theorists, including Henry Kissinger, Thomas Schelling, and Daniel Ellsberg, start playing around with ideas about how to possibly change US grand strategy in the late 50s moving into the 60s. And they come up with a range of ideas, which include the suspension of rationality in negotiating and what's called the political use of madness, which was a paper that Daniel Ellsberg gave. Henry Kissinger comes up with the idea of limited nuclear war. And these ideas are developed, as I said, on the campuses of Harvard University and the Rand Corporation. And then they are incorporated in part by the likes of Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and arguably Donald Trump.
So tell us a little bit more about Nixon. How did he use this?
So Richard Nixon is central to any understanding of the Madman theory, certainly in terms of its potential implications and implementation. He was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower between 1953 and 1961. And during that time period, he witnessed Eisenhower's attempts to end the Korean War. And one of the ways that that was done, it is believed, was by Eisenhower secretly passing a message through the Indians to the Chinese that the United States would resort to an atomic attack on the Korean Peninsula if an armistice was not signed. Richard Nixon believed that that was responsible for ending the war and took that approach through his time as vice president, including ideas that he developed and understood from Syngman Rhee, who was leading the South Korean nation at that time period, believing, therefore, that the threat of extreme force brought peace. And when he eventually became president, not in 1961 as he'd hoped, but in January of 1969, he brought that approach to the White House, along with his new national security advisor, one Dr. Henry Kissinger, who had developed similar ideas whilst he was at Harvard. And so between them, Nixon and Kissinger bring this approach to the White House in an attempt to end the war in Vietnam. And in that instance, you see a series of attempts to implement the Madman theory across Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, all in an attempt to end the war on American terms.
So just explain that to me a little bit more. What evidence do we have that he was actually consciously using that and trying to appear as if he was unstable?
Well, this is a great question, because one of the challenges with this is that you will never find a policy document signed by anybody saying we're going to implement the Madman theory, because that would utterly undermine the very approach. It's meant to be a feigned act of irrationality, which, of course, if you suggested ahead of time we were going to do that, would undermine the very concept itself. The first source for this is the memoir of a chap called H.R. Haldeman, Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff. And in his 1978 memoir, he recounts the tale of a conversation between Richard Nixon and himself in the summer of 1968, in which Nixon tells Haldeman that when he becomes president, if he wins that election, he will secretly pass word to the Vietnamese leadership, and he believes that Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris begging for peace as a result of this. That's quite a disputed source, it must be pointed out. But several years later on, the White House transcripts emerge and the tapes emerge of conversations between Kissinger and Nixon in the Oval Office, including conversations that Ted Heath was involved in which Nixon and Kissinger both talk about potentially using extreme excessive force, including nuclear weapons, the bombing of harbours, the bombing of dikes, in an attempt to force the Vietnamese to the negotiating table. So there is recorded conversations to this effect, indicating both Kissinger and Nixon's propensity for extreme excessive violence and the potential use of the Madman theory in Vietnam.
So Nixon is often described as suspicious, paranoid, calculating. How much do you think his own character shaped his use of the Madman theory?
Well, I think it did. Certainly, Richard Nixon was, at the very least, a complex character, someone not naturally drawn to politics. He was someone who I think took slights very much to heart, but he was someone who also, I believe, looked at what Eisenhower did. Eisenhower was a great hero to Richard Nixon, and thought, well, that worked for Eisenhower, it can work for me. Nixon was trying to negotiate his way out of a very difficult situation in Vietnam. He had inherited it from Lyndon Johnson. He wanted to take it in a different direction. He believed in the concept of peace through strength, which of course then gets inherited by Ronald Reagan and arguably by Donald Trump as well. And so you see Nixon's character, I think, come to the fore. He's someone who wants to demonstrate his strength of personality, portray that through national strength. I think he's egged on in part by Henry Kissinger, who is a very interesting character in his own right. Someone who I think is very good at playing the advisor to an individual like Nixon and bringing out potentially his worst sides rather than his better angels, as Lincoln might have thought about it. And so I think between them, they adopt this theory and try to implement it in a series of incidents across the Vietnam War. To what extent that works, it must be pointed out, is debatable.
Well, exactly. Let's look at how it worked. I mean, particularly during the Cold War, are there instances where clearly it did achieve its aims?
Well, this is what's remarkable about it. People talk about the Madman theory, and I think it's a widely misunderstood concept. But if one is to look at how Nixon does try to employ it in Vietnam and in Indochina more broadly, one can see examples of where it is employed. Where it becomes more difficult is to see where it actually succeeded. He certainly uses contradictory policies, both at one point withdrawing American troops whilst at the same time increasing bombing in a seemingly irrational display of policy across Vietnam. We see him threatening, promising to end the war whilst at the same time going into Cambodia, which again most people would say was an irrational, contradictory act. You also see him, of course, going against congressional mandate to illegally bomb in Cambodia. So we see a whole range of seemingly irrational acts, but none of these things seem to be successful in bringing the war to a conclusion any time sooner than can possibly have been achieved through other means. So certainly under Richard Nixon, the great problem ultimately is this. The Madman theory relies upon an opponent believing that the instigator of the Madman theory has lost his mind and will act like a madman. And I think the great problem that Richard Nixon had was that despite his best efforts, he could not convince the leadership in the Soviet Union, in Beijing, or in North Vietnam that he was indeed mad enough to go all the way and to deploy nuclear weapons and to commit what would effectively be clearly a war crime.
And are there examples where it really didn't work or perhaps spiraled out of control?
Well, interestingly, one of the operations that Richard Nixon did instigate, which I haven't mentioned yet, is the 1969 nuclear alert. And what happened in this instance is that during the Cold War, it was common practice for the United States to regularly have aircraft airborne, operational, fully armed with nuclear weapons at what's called a fail-safe position, a go, no-go point approaching the Arctic, at which point these planes would approach, hover for a period of time, and then always return to base, unless, of course, they were given orders to go on and attack the Soviet Union. And if anybody has seen Dr. Strangelove, you may well recognize this strategy. Well, Nixon actually instigated this. He launched a whole series of nuclear-armed aircraft in 1969 and held them at the fail-safe position, not for a short time period, but for 3 whole days. In the hope that the Kremlin would see this and realize that Nixon was on the verge of potentially attacking the Soviet Union if the Vietnam War did not end. In the end, Brezhnev refused to go along, didn't take the threat seriously, and the attack was never instigated. The aircraft were brought home. Now, clearly, this was a very dangerous scenario. If you have any nuclear aircraft orbiting that sort of airspace for any time period, especially in the Arctic, you risk what's known as a broken arrow, the idea of a lost nuclear weapon or a downed aircraft through technical or human malfunction. Thankfully, neither of those things happened, but that was certainly a very dangerous and underreported incident in the Cold War, an example of Richard Nixon employing the madman theory, or at least threatening it.
All right, then. So to the present day, do you think that comparisons between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump are credible?
I think they are. I think that what you see is Richard Nixon acting as a fulcrum, if in many ways, between the past and the present. Nixon clearly looked at what Eisenhower did as inspiration for his actions as president, and Donald Trump has routinely talked about his praise and his admiration for Richard Nixon and how he approached policy. And if we look at what Donald Trump does, and he is certainly a polarizing figure, you can see that he has attempted through his first term and second term to utilize the madman theory approach to international relations in an attempt to gain an advantage for the United States as part of his American first approach to foreign policy. And we can see that in issues to do with trade, international negotiations, and international relations more broadly, I think.
Trump is often described as erratic, easily bored, impulsive, and so on. So how much of this is to do with clear calculation, and how much of it is just his character?
Well, all those things you say about Donald Trump may well be true, but that does not prevent him from instigating the madman theory. One of the great challenges in any observation or discussion of Donald Trump is an interesting idea, which is that I think a great many people, both in academia and journalism and generally around the world, are very happy to believe that Donald Trump is mad. And therefore, discussion of the madman theory has become very popular again. But that, of course, misunderstands what the madman theory is about. The madman theory, by definition, is not invoked by a madman, but by a sane individual feigning irrationality in an attempt to try and convince his opponents otherwise. Donald Trump, therefore, has an advantage on Richard Nixon. If Richard Nixon failed in his application of the madman theory because opponents did not believe he was mad, Donald Trump has the advantage in as much as people do think he's mad, and therefore an attempt to implement the madman theory is more widely believed because people are already one step ahead and think, oh my goodness, maybe the president is indeed crazy enough to do this. Richard Nixon required Henry Kissinger to fly around the world to take leaders to one side and say, oh my goodness, you must help me. I'm working for someone I thought was sane, and Richard Nixon is crazy enough to do this. We must work together to prevent something terrible happening, or he will drop a nuclear bomb in Hanoi. Donald Trump does not need a Henry Kissinger to do that. There are enough people around the world who, incorrectly in my opinion, believe Donald Trump is crazy enough to go through with some of the instances and actions which he has potentially raised as president of the United States. And we see that time and time again, which is why, arguably, in many instances, he has been quite successful in negotiating trade deals, international relations agreements, and that will no doubt continue until his last days in office.
What if, though, the madness is genuine rather than strategic?
Well, that's a fine question, but one must ask what signs of madness Donald Trump has exhibited. He is certainly an exuberant individual, but I think that that is the very question, I think, in many ways demonstrates a bias in an approach to Donald Trump, which we should try and put to one side if we're going to try to analyze what it is he is doing from a neutral point of view. Certainly, Donald Trump has policies which many people will disagree with, and I can certainly understand that. But in his approach to foreign policy, one can see time and time again a pattern. Which is going into negotiations, threatening either excessive force or excessive punitive tariffs, as we saw a little under a year ago, all in a negotiating tactic. You go in hard, you hit individuals up and say, we're going to impose 50, 60% tariffs. In the full expectation that your negotiating partner will come back and say, well, that's terrible. We can't possibly have 60% tariffs. And then you come in and you agree at a figure which would still have been unimaginable, but suddenly looks quite like a success compared to the opening gambit. That, of course, has played out with regard to the tariff policy in a whole series of countries, including our own here in the UK, across the European Union. Nation after nation has come back to the negotiating table and said, all right, let's make a deal. And Donald Trump has walked away with having brought trillions of dollars into the United States Treasury over the last 12 months. And he will see that as very much part of leveling the playing fields and ending what I think he thought was unfair trade tactics. You see that also with regard to issues of international relations. In time and again, he goes in very hard. The secret is this: you do not ask for what you want, because that is the bare minimum and your opponent will start chipping away at that. You ask for considerably more than you want and you come away with almost certainly more than you would expect.
I wonder how it plays with allies, though. I mean, if they perceive somebody as mad, does that damage trust or as much as it deters enemies?
Well, this is one of the great challenges with Donald Trump and where he differentiates himself from Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, I think, would never have thought about utilizing the madman theory with allies, whereas Donald Trump is very happy to say, friend, foe, my job is to further the aims of the United States, and that's it. I am president of the United States, not president of the wider world. And you have seen that play out, I think, with regard to NATO and the threats to withdraw from NATO if European allies do not increase their military contributions. Now, that is a very drastic, very serious thing to do. He has not done so, of course, and the United States is still in NATO. My understanding is that there was more serious consideration given to withdrawing from NATO in the first term than perhaps many people thought. He repeatedly undermined faith in NATO by refusing to guarantee American adherence to Article 5, which was the collective security agreement in that. However, Donald Trump's aim was to get European allies to increase their military contributions, which was a continuation of policy which was sought by George W. Bush, by Barack Obama, and by Joe Biden. And he has succeeded in doing so. Shortly before he came to office, the European leaders agreed to guarantee a 2.5%, raising to 3%. Donald Trump has now got pledges to rise to 5%. That figure would have been unimaginable without Donald Trump's decisions and attempts to play the madman theory card, arguably, with NATO. Was it a very dangerous, risky strategy? Absolutely. Does it appear to have worked? So far.
And how is he utilising it with Greenland?
So Greenland is the latest example whereby Donald Trump appears to be utilising the madman theory on the international stage. Donald Trump is the latest in a series of American presidents who have looked at Greenland and believed it is in the American interest to have that as either part of the nation or as a protectorate. Whether it ever becomes one of the American states is open for debate. But certainly when the United States looked at purchasing Alaska, for example, it also looked at Greenland. Harry Truman in 1946 looked at ways of drawing Greenland into the United States as part of the Cold War. Donald Trump is the latest, therefore, in a line of American presidents who have looked at Greenland and thought, there is a strategic advantage to the United States of having control over this territory in one form or another. There is a reason for that. If you look at shipping lanes, if you look at the minerals that are on Greenland, if you look at the fact that the United States has a space base there, which could easily be developed, if you look at Russia and Chinese attempts to gain a foothold in the Arctic, it's clearly, from Donald Trump's point of view, there is a strategic benefit to having that. And he has let it be known through leaks, etc., that there might well be the military option to go in and take the island, the territory by force. And as Secretary of State Marco Rubio said only yesterday, any American president should leave every option on the table. That is Donald Trump's approach to strategy at all points. Now, that is in stark contrast to someone like Barack Obama, of course, who was a very rational, level-headed individual, and Donald Trump used to take great issue with that in saying, you're telegraphing our positions before the negotiations have even begun. That is terrible negotiating. I think what Donald Trump tries to do is take the same very tough-nosed approach that he had to negotiating in real estate in Manhattan to a global stage. So now the great fear is there a 1% chance Donald Trump could launch a military exercise to take Greenland by force from Denmark? Possibly. Do I think he will do it? No. Is there a 1% chance he could do it? Absolutely. And that, in a nutshell, is a madman theory. You let your negotiating tactic partner believe that there's a 1% chance something might happen, and that puts the fear of God into people. So you say, all right, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is we will buy Greenland. That suddenly looks like a very attractive offer and a hell of a lot better than a military opportunity.
I wonder how the media sustains this, the modern media. Has it made the madman theory easier to sustain or easier to fake, if you like?
Well, what the media has done with the best one in the world is to confuse the general population about what the madman theory is. One of the things I try to do in my forthcoming book, US Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory, is to explain what it is, what it isn't, when it's been applied, and to highlight the fact that it is routinely misreported, misunderstood, because, I hate to say it, the media and many of my colleagues in academia believe Donald Trump to be mad and then equate the madman theory with the actions of a madman. And that is simply not what the policy is about. For it to be the true application of the madman theory, it has to be feigned, not actual. It is the application of a feigned irrationale by a sane leader. And what you see Donald Trump doing time and time again in case after case is threatening overwhelming force, a disproportionate response, if you will, to a series of incidents, be that trade, international relations, in an attempt to get what he wants as quickly as possible without a shot being fired and as cheaply as possible. And that is routinely borne out both during his first term and now during his second term. And the media, I think, could do a great better job by trying to understand what the madman theory really is and to explain Donald Trump's actions in a balanced way. And I think that the White House has a good point when it says that there is clear unwillingness to do that.
But I mean, how can we as the media tell the difference between chaos as strategy and chaos as chaos?
Well, and this is nothing personal, the media could do a great better job of trying to make that distinction and try to understand what it is that's going in, rather than going in from a pre-existing point of view and saying, well, we believe Donald Trump is mad. Therefore, we see his actions as being mad. Look at this. Only a madman would talk about doing these things, whether that is withdrawing from NATO, whether that's taking Greenland by force, etc., etc. And without saying, well, is this part of a wider strategy? Can we see a pattern? Well, there is a pattern, I think. We see a pattern emerging through the first term. He talked about it going through the election. Donald Trump is many things. He is not mad. And if people take the time to actually listen to what he says in speeches and look at policy documents, he's quite forthright. If you look, for example, at what's just happened in Venezuela, only a few weeks ago, people were up in arms in the UK about the national security strategy that came out. Oh, it's terrible. Where's Europe in all this? There's such a focus upon the Western Hemisphere. Well, yes, there was. There was also a huge military build-up in the Caribbean leading up to this. So you put those two factors together. You talk about the fact that Donald Trump had made overtures to getting rid of the leadership in Venezuela, and then all of a sudden the world wakes up and it's happened. Arguably one of the great differences between Donald Trump and other leaders is other leaders have talked. Donald Trump has acted.
I mean, I see what you're saying, and I see that it's true, but I do think that surely elements of his personality, like his ego and what I believe to be his narcissism, come into it. When you look at remarks like Maduro's dancing, how Donald Trump took exception to the fact that he felt that Maduro was making fun of him by copying his dance moves. I mean, that doesn't seem to serve any purpose other than pandering to his own ego.
Well, you're smart enough to think that he didn't take this leader because he was mocking his dance. Come on, this is hilarious. It's important to realise, actually, I'm going to pick up on one word he used there, which is interesting, which is narcissism. One of the things I try and do in the book is to focus upon some of the medical ailments that leaders have exhibited in the past, which the madman theory then seeks to feign. To replicate effectively, to convince other leaders that they are indeed implementing the madman theory and might indeed be quote unquote mad. And narcissism is actually one of the ailments which I address in the book, along with issues to do with paranoia and depression. World leaders have routinely suffered from these. You may well have interviewed some of them. And we can certainly think of examples, I think, about where that has occurred and what this does to leadership. There was a very interesting case by Dr. David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary, who wrote several years ago now that he believed that Tony Blair was suffering from a God complex because of some of the medication he had been taking, and that had generated a whole series of medical conditions which had led him, in Dr. Owen's perspective, to seek out this new messianic approach to the world, along with George W. Bush during his time in office. So is Donald Trump a narcissist? I don't think you'd get too many people arguing with that. But what he has done, and this comes back to a point I made earlier, is that he uses public perception of him and his character to basically more easily implement the madman theory, because people are very willing to believe that he is a madman because they think he's a narcissist, for example, and therefore are terrified that he might actually go through with some of these threats, whereas a more sane individual, perceived sane individual like Richard Nixon, had difficulty convincing people of that.
So could the madman theory be applied in business, in the boardroom, for instance?
Well, when one considers what Donald Trump is doing, I would suggest to you that what Donald Trump is doing is taking the practices that he used in real estate in Manhattan and he's bringing it to the global stage. And by that I mean this. In business, if one is in a negotiating tactic and goes in and merely asks for what one wants, the other side will take that as the beginning of a bargaining situation and start chipping away at that, so that your own position is diminished from the very beginning. You aren't going to get what you want. You might get some part of it. What the madman theory approach would suggest is that rather than asking for what you want, you ask for a much larger goal, whether that's a financial reward or whatever, in the hope that your negotiating partner will look at this and be aghast and think, oh my goodness, this is excessive. I can't possibly acquiesce to that. But why don't we start haggling? and then you will immediately start haggling and negotiating from a much higher position than you actually have any intention of achieving, so that you are now in a much stronger position. We saw that, for example, with Donald Trump with his use of tariffs, going and saying he wants to impose tariffs of 50-60%. In a previous tariff-free zone. His negotiating partners South suddenly think, oh my goodness, we're going to hit 6% tariffs. What if we go back and say, well, can we agree at 20? It's 20% more than they might have been paying previously, but it's a lot better than 60%, giving Donald Trump a victory and suddenly bringing in 20% tariffs where there were nothing before, for example.
What happens, either in business or politics, if more than one person is using the madman theory? For instance, say Vladimir Putin's doing it too.
Well, this is one of the great challenges, and where it comes down to really understanding the mindset of the leader in question. I think one of the things that we are all guilty of in the West, perhaps for understandable reasons, is not adequately understanding the mindset of those leaders which we have to deal with routinely in other parts of the world. The CIA, throughout much of the Cold War, attempted to psychoanalyze foreign leaders. Didn't have a great track record of doing so, because you bring bias to that and you start applying ideas like madman, lunatic, etc. to these individuals. And Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un are just two of the latest examples of that. What happens if that were to really be borne out is very difficult to speculate upon. It hasn't happened to date. The assumption has always been in the West, well, if a leader is crazy enough to threaten the West with nuclear attack, as it was, of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, maybe Khrushchev has gone mad, maybe he's been deposed. Maybe, however, there was a different situation there, which was that Khrushchev was a very sane individual, and he saw the West encircling the Soviet Union, as it was, with its own nuclear missiles just across the Black Sea, and wanted to alter the nuclear balance by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, some 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Thankfully, in that case, sane minds prevailed in both the Kremlin and the White House. If that situation were to happen now, one can only speculate as to what the outcome might be.
James, it's very clear that we all need to read your book to understand this completely. Just give me the title again.
It's, well, I agree entirely with you. It's called US Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory, From Nixon to Trump. It'll be published in the spring by Manchester University Press and is available for pre-order right now.
James Boyes, thank you for coming on Visionary.
My pleasure. Thank you.